Welcome to the second talk of the part 5 of the International Christian University Linguistic Colloquium, organized with the theme of prosody. I'm happy to introduce the second speaker, Natalie Weber. Natalie is an assistant professor at Yale University. Their research program is in theoretical phonology and issues at the syntax-prosody interface, including the relationship between syntactic and prosodic constituents, phonological realization of morphemes, and linearization. Their dissertation, Syntax-Prosody and Metrical Structure in Blackfoot, focuses on structural correspondences at the interface. And in the dissertation, they argued that the syntax-prosody correspondence is distinct from the alignment of prosodic and metrical structure. Natalie also has a strong interest in documenting and analyzing understudied languages, such as Blackfoot, which was the topic of her dissertation, their dissertation. Thank you for being here, and let's welcome Natalie, who will talk about on the misalignment of prosodic H's and syllables.
Thank you so much, Seunghun. It's really great to be here, and see if I can get this shared.
Mm-hmm.
Super.
Yes.
So I'm here to talk about the misalignment of prosodic edges and syllables, and I want to begin with a bit of a typological puzzle. Now, it's well known that prosodic edges may sometimes align with syllable edges at the expense of syntax-prosody alignment, so allowing mismatches between syntax and prosody. And the key cases to look at in this case are places where there is a syntactic or a morphological constituent that begins with a vowel at the left edge. So I'll continue to mark syntactic constituents with this curly brace. And in this case, if the stem or syntactic constituent is preceded by a prefix, as long as the last element of the prefix syllabifies together with the initial vowel of the syntactic constituent, there are two different ways that we might expect misalignments to occur. So in the first case, the initial vowel of the stem is underparsed and it's left out of the prosodic stem. And in the second case, the last element, that is the consonant or the vowel at the right edge of the prefix, is overparsed into the prosodic stem. And both of these kinds of mismatches are attested in the literature. For example, some of the phonological evidence that comes to bear on this is reduplication in IsiXhosa, where the reduplicant, it takes as its base a prosodic constituent, which I've marked with this square bracket. And the reduplicant will prefix to a consonant initial stem and take that stem as its base. But in the case of vowel initial stems, the reduplicant will infix right past that initial vowel, simply ignoring it. So in this case, this is evidence that the initial vowel of the stem, which is marked here in red, is underparsed and not included in the prosodic constituent that the reduplicant takes as the base. And conversely, in Kehehe, we see the opposite effect, where again, the reduplicant takes as its base a prosodic constituent. And so there is perfect alignment for the consonant initial stems, but when the stem begins with a vowel, the reduplicant actually exfixes and includes the last consonant, which in this case is the only consonant of the prefix there. So in this case, the blue consonant of the prefix is included inside of the prosodic stem and is copied over into the reduplicant. Now, it's exactly these sorts of mismatches which are often taken as evidence that prosodic constituents are distinct from syntactic constituents in any kind of indirect reference theory of the syntax and prosody interface. And so just for clarity, whenever I talk about prosodic edges or prosodic constituents in this talk, I mean exactly those kinds of constituents which are extrinsically defined by their relation to syntax. Ito and Master in a 2012 paper called these the interface categories. And so I won't be including metrical or rhythmic or sonority related categories in the term prosodic whenever I use this term. Now, to return to the puzzle, we might expect a third kind of language, namely one where prosodic edges and syllable edges misalign, and instead we've maintained the syntax and prosody alignment. So in this third type of language, this square bracket representing the left edge of the prosodic stem is in the exact same place as the curly brace, representing the left edge of the syntactic or morphological stem. But as a consequence, the left edge of the prosodic stem falls in the middle of a syllable. And to my knowledge, I don't know of any cases in the literature that have argued for such an alignment, although I'd be curious to know if you do. And in the course of this talk, I want to argue that Blackfoot is the kind of language that exactly fills this expected gap. Now, to make an argument for this, that there is a prosodic edge and that it falls in the middle of a syllable, we need a couple of ingredients. And so the rest of the talk will go as follows. After a section discussing language background and a little bit about syllable structure in Blackfoot, I will first present evidence for the left edge of a prosodic constituent. After that, I'll turn and show that there is evidence that syllables do actually span that left edge and don't align exactly with the edge of the prosodic constituent. And then finally, I'll show that there's no alternative analysis available where the syntax and prosody misalign in order to align the prosodic edge to a syllable edge. All right, so getting started. Blackfoot is an Algonquian language. It is the westernmost Algonquian language, which is outlined here in black, and it's spoken in northern Montana and southern Alberta. It's exceedingly polysynthetic and head marking. But to simplify the morphosyntax in a way, the stem has been shown in previous work to consist of a root followed by one or two verbalizing suffixes, therefore forming a little VP. And the entire verbal complex itself consists of that stem, the VP stem, followed by clausal heads representing I and C, and preceded by any number of prefixes. And this entire verbal complex forms a CP. So I won't have time in the talk to go through the evidence for each of these edges, but in previous work I've argued that the edges of the CP and the edges of the little VP also map to prosodic domains. And in this talk, we'll be focusing on the left edge of the prosodic word. The data in this talk come from two different sources. So first, I've given transcriptions based on my fieldwork with native speakers, and especially with Dotsinam, whose name is Beatrice Bullshields in English. Anytime that the transcription comes from her speech, it'll be accompanied by BB. But in addition, I'll be discussing various morpheme alternations, and for that, I've relied heavily on reference materials, including the most recent grammar and dictionary by Don France. Here's the phonological inventory for Blackfoot. It's a relatively small number of contrasts, which are greatly expanded through a length distinction. I will be using the orthography and the morphemic analysis lines, and so typically it's very similar to the IPA system here. In cases where the orthography differs, I've given you the orthography there in angled brackets. And we want to pay a bit of attention to syllable structure at the beginning of the talk, because later on we will use diagnostics for syllabification to argue that a CV sequence across this morpheme boundary or a VV sequence are actually syllabified together. So there will be three different diagnostics here, and I will walk through each of these in turn. The first fact about a syllable structure in Blackfoot is that vowel length is neutralized before a coda consonant. So we know that there's a distinction between short vowels and long vowels, as given here in a minimal pair between akuka, he will rope, and akuka, she will hold a sundance. And for to mark this length difference in the analysis, I'll adopt Moraic theory, where I assume that short vowels are monomoraic and long vowels are bimoraic. However, this contrast doesn't hold before coda consonants, where you can have a short vowel before a coda consonant and no long vowels at all. So the maximal syllable is either CVV with a long vowel in an open syllable, or CVC with a short vowel in a closed syllable. So this is our first diagnostic for determining whether a consonant is actually a coda consonant or not. If a consonant is parsed to a coda position, then the preceding vowel must be short. And an analysis of this vowel neutralization will take us a little bit farther away from where I want to go in this talk. So I won't go into more details on this, but we'll use it as a diagnostic. The second aspect about syllable structure in Blackfoot is that onsetless syllables are always resolved. They're prohibited. So as long as there's an onsetless syllable inside of the phonological phrase, vowel coalescence will resolve the onsetless syllable. So you can see this in alternations from a vowel initial suffix like eep, which means bring. And as long as bring occurs after a consonant on the left-hand side here, then the vowel simply surfaces faithfully after the consonant. But when a vowel initial suffix follows a vowel, those two vowels come together and fuse so that you end up with a long vowel that is midway in vowel quality between the two underlying vowel qualities. It's good that Emily is here because there is an existing analysis of vowel coalescence and other vowel hiatus resolution strategies in Blackfoot. And I will assume that the vowel fusion here violates uniformity at a minimum, as well as other featural violations that aren't shown here. So as long as uniformity is ranked below onset, as well as these other markedness constraints, then candidate E, the one with vowel fusion, will be the optimal candidate. And it's crucial to note that something like candidate F, which also has this vowel fusion, but which treats each of these, each mora as a separate syllable, is harmonically bound because it incurs an extra violation of onset in addition to the violation of uniformity. So we can take from this that anytime we see a coalesced vowel, that it is syllabified as a single nucleus. When an onsetless vowel occurs at the left edge of the phonological phrase, there isn't a preceding vowel that it can fuse with, and so instead there's a epenthesis of a glottal stop in this position. And luckily for us, the exact same constraint configuration that we saw before predicts this. Okay? So that candidate C is the optimal candidate here. And finally, the third aspect about syllable structure to note is that codas are highly restricted and only come in a couple of different kinds. So you can have a coda that is a glottal stop, a dorsal fricative, or an alveolar fricative, as well as the first half of a geminate consonant. And that any other kind of cluster which arises across a boundary is resolved via epenthesis. So this is seen here with the consonant initial suffix pa, which means tie. When the pa occurs after a consonant like k in the left-hand side here, then there's an epenthetic vowel e, which occurs between those two consonants and breaks up the illicit cluster. And conversely, when this suffix occurs after a vowel, it simply concatenates directly. And so you'll see the vowel followed by the consonant here. No epenthesis needed. Okay, so abstracting away from the exact conditions that determine which codas are allowed and which are not, I'll use a cover term like coda condition as a constraint here. And as long as that is ranked above dep, then we will get the correct answers here. So a cluster like the glottal stop followed by K is perfectly illicit and is tolerated because it does not violate coda cond. But a cluster such as K followed by P does violate coda cond. And so instead, the most optimal candidate is one that violates dep as well as dep mora in order to epenthesize this E. So in summary, there's three diagnostics that we'll be using later. One is that vowel length is neutralized before codas. The second is that onsetless syllables are prohibited and they are always resolved. And the third is that codas are highly restricted and illicit clusters are avoided via epenthesis. All right, with that background out of the way, we can turn to evidence for the left edge of a prosodic constituent. So what I want to show in this section is that there is a phonologically active constraint against non-continuant segments that holds at the left edge of the prosodic word. And this constraint is going to drive root alternations, so that's what we will use as evidence for this constraint. And in order to do so, we must look at roots in two different positions. So one is the root when it stands at the left edge of the prosodic phrase, because in this position, the left edge of the prosodic phrase and the left edge of the prosodic word are the same. And the second location is looking at the root after any kind of prefix, because in this location, the left edge of the prosodic word and the left edge of the prosodic phrase are distinct. So the data will look a little bit like this. Here I've taken a root which begins with a short vowel, in this case a short vowel E. And when this root occurs at the left edge of the phonological phrase, the E is of course there, plus this epenthetic glottal stop. And after any kind of prefix, regardless of whether it ends in a consonant or in a vowel, there will also be an E, at least in the underlying form. So how that gets resolved is after a consonant, the E simply concatenates with the preceding consonant. And after a vowel, of course, we see the same kind of vowel fusion that we saw before. So after this A in the imperfective, the E and the A coalesce together, and we end up with this long vowel with a vowel quality that's midway between A and E. In the interest of time, I'm going to just leave this as the one example of short vowels. However, if you have questions, we can come back and look at the roots that begin with short vowel O, as well as roots that begin with short vowel A. And instead, I'll just show you the summary of those patterns here. So there are some roots like itzin, which means among, which have their leftmost vowel is E in both locations, that is at the left edge of the phonological phrase, as well as after a prefix. There are some roots like ok, snare, that begin with an O in both locations. And there are two patterns of roots that begin with an A at the left edge of the phonological phrase. Some of them instead begin with an E after a prefix, with the same resulting coalescence that we saw with itzin, and some of them begin with O. And there are no roots at all which begin in a short A in both locations. Okay? So in this case, abstracting, well, I won't go into the details on the analysis here, but I've assumed that these two forms are actually lexically listed in the lexicon, and that they are chosen via phonologically optimizing allomorphy. All right, so turning to roots which begin with an obstruent, we'll see a slightly different pattern, and it's this puzzle that I'll focus on for the rest of the talk. There are some roots that begin with obstruents at the left edge of the phonological phrase, like pom, which means to transfer. And after a consonant, of course, a KP cluster is not allowed in Blackfoot. And so it's unsurprising that we see an epenthetic vowel E after a consonant. However, it is a little bit surprising that after a vowel, we see that there is some kind of vowel mutation here. So the vowel is long and the vowel is mid, when in any other place of the word, it's perfectly licit to concatenate an A followed by a pa. Okay? So the puzzle is, why is there this odd vowel quality that is here? And moreover, it can't be driven by syllable structure. So if we take the same kind of syllable structure constraints that we had before, the syllable structure constraints will explain why it is that we get epenthesis between the K and the P here. That's because it violates this high-ranked coda condition. And instead, the most optimal candidate is one that violates step as well as step mora in order to epenthesize this E. But the same syllable structure constraints cannot explain why we get a long and coalesced vowel whenever this root follows a vowel. And the reason is that simply concatenating the A with the P gives a perfectly well-formed syllable structure all on its own. And so any other changes that we make, all of the constraints that get violated in order to change the vowel quality from short A to long E, make the actual spoken version of this word suboptimal. Okay, so from this I conclude that this change in vowel quality and length can't be driven by syllable structure constraints. And so what could it be? And in order to answer that question, we have to bring up two further observations. The first observation is that I've shown you, okay, one type of root alternation that occurs for roots that begin with an obstruent. There are many other kinds of root alternations that occur in Blackfoot, of which I've shown just a subset of them here. And you can see that there are many different kinds of processes occurring at the left edge of roots. Sometimes vowels are being epenthesized, sometimes nasals are being deleted, sometimes an entire vowel consonant sequence is being added to the left edge. But all of them have one thing in common, which is that every single root has a single form that occurs at the left edge of the phonological phrase and a second form that occurs after a prefix. And it doesn't matter if the prefix begins in a consonant or a vowel, you'll have the same form in both cases. And so perhaps we could explain the odd behavior of transfer by looking at this, namely that transfer itself has two different forms. One of them occurs at the left edge of the phonological phrase, and the second form, which has this E at the left edge, occurs after a prefix, regardless of whether that prefix ends in a consonant or in a vowel. Okay, so in this case, it looks like there is a general pattern for root alternations in the language, and the pattern for transfer fits in with that general observation. Now, the second generalization that we should look at is if we make generalizations over the left edge of roots in both of these locations, then we see that there are particular places and particular consonants that are prohibited. So when looking at the left edge of the phonological phrase, there is no root that begins with a glide in that location. The phonological phrase never begins with a glide. And similarly, when looking after a prefix, there is no root that begins with a stop, whether it's a plosive or a nasal. And so I propose that the change in vowel quality and length can be explained because there are root alternations and also epenthesis that are occurring in order to satisfy an edge constraint that's holding at the left edge of the prosodic word. All right, so in order to see how this will take care of the vowel quality change for us, we need to introduce two new constraints. One of them is this positional markedness constraint that says assign a violation mark for every non-continuant segment which is leftmost in the prosodic word. And the second constraint we need to introduce is an alignment constraint between prosodic word edges and syllable edges. And here I've given, again, the same constraint ranking we had before, but I've slotted both of these constraints in and underlined them for you. And both of these will be relevant. All right, so when we look at these obstruent initial roots after a vowel, we see that there is a crucial ranking of this positional markedness constraint over the constraints that penalize epenthesis. And in this case, as well as uniformity and quite a lot of other constraints, because the optimal candidate is one, of course, that satisfies the positional markedness constraint by epenthesizing a vowel here at the left edge of the prosodic word. So whereas the straight and very nice syllable structure faithful candidate has the left edge of the prosodic word bumped up against this minus continuant segment, now we've removed the prosodic word from that non-continuant segment by epenthesizing something. And since we've epenthesized a mora and a segment here, the normal syllable structure constraints take over. The coalesced version is still the optimal candidate in this case. Okay? Now, the optimal candidate in this case does violate this alignment constraint in the way that I've shown it, in the sense that this prosodic word edge is smack in the middle of a syllable. And you might be able to think of other candidates that could satisfy this alignment constraint between edges of prosodic words and syllables in other ways. And we'll get to that soon enough. So just at the moment, we're interested in how is it that we could get this vowel quality in such a position as this. And this positional markedness constraint will do it for us. Okay? So this was looking at this root after vowels. After consonants, then of course the coda condition constraint is still in play here. And so as long as that is ranked highly enough, we still get epenthesis as we would expect. And again, this epenthesis is occurring at the left edge of the prosodic word so that we are avoiding violations of the positional markedness constraint. And because we've done that, the prosodic word itself falls in the middle of a syllable, thereby violating this alignment constraint between prosodic words and syllables. Okay. And finally, at the left edge, there is a tiny problem in the sense that if epenthesis is the way to avoid violations of this positional markedness constraint, then why not do it at the left edge? And of course, the way that this word is actually spoken, it does have an obstruent at the left edge and does not epenthesize an entire syllable at all. So something must be done here, and it seems that epenthesis of an entire more at the left edge of the phonological phrase is not allowed. So for this, we can introduce one other constraint, namely the leftmost more in a CP in the input. If it has a correspondent in the output that is not leftmost in a phonological phrase, then assign a violation. So this is whatever was the leftmost mora in the CP should not have anything else to the left of it in the output. Okay? And once we add in this anchor constraint at the left edge, then the candidates that epenthesize an entire syllable are now suboptimal, and we again get the right answer. Okay? So overall, what this shows is that there is evidence for the left edge of a prosodic word. Namely, there's an edge restriction against non-continuant segments, and it is phonologically active in that it triggers root alternations, including this epenthesis case, which is the one that I've been showing you throughout the talk. So I take this as evidence that this constraint does hold of a prosodic constituent and not a syntactic constituent, because it seems to be active. So it's not simply a morpheme structure constraint. It's not simply a static generalization that holds because of some historical accident. It interacts with the phonology in a particular way. And so following many indirect reference theories, I'll assume that these phonological generalizations and phonological processes only apply to prosodic constituents. All right. So just to recap what we've just said, we're looking at the left edge of this little VP in the syntax, which gets mapped to the left edge of a prosodic word in the prosody. And I've said that the optimal candidates here violate an alignment constraint between the left edge of the prosodic word and the left edge of syllables. And so there are two further things that we need to double check. One, we need to see if there is evidence that there really is a syllable that spans this boundary. Perhaps I am wrong. And the second is to consider alternative accounts and to argue against accounts that allow syntax-prosody misalignment for Blackfoot, just like the languages we saw at the beginning of the talk. So I'll talk about each of these claims in turn. Okay. So rather briefly, there is a lot of evidence that syllables do span the left edge of this prosodic word, which I will continue to mark with a square bracket. In this case, we're looking at the root after a consonant, and so there's been epenthesis of a vowel here. And we might ask ourselves, all right, here's the optimal candidate B from before. Candidate A is the faithful candidate that has no epenthesis, but we might consider two more candidates like C or D, where the final consonant of this prefix is parsed as a coda. But there is language internal evidence that this can't be the case. So first of all, vowel length is not neutralized before this final K, indicating that it is not actually a coda. And we already know that onsetless syllables are not allowed anywhere in Blackfoot. And so we would not expect this E at the left edge of the prosodic word to begin a new syllable itself. And indeed, simply given the constraints ranking that we already had, C and D, which do allow the left edge of the prosodic word to begin a new syllable, are suboptimal. So both the real language diagnostics as well as our constraint ranking both rule out any kind of candidate where a new syllable begins at the left edge of this prosodic domain. And again, the optimal candidate in this case is one where a syllable spans the left edge. Okay. So similarly, when we look at these obstruent initial roots after a vowel, we want to see whether this long e actually spans, actually is syllabified together as it spans the left edge of the prosodic word. And yes, it does. So we had already said that when vowel coalescence occurs, the resulting long vowel is parsed as a single syllable nucleus. So coalescence itself is evidence that this is a single syllable. And again, this can't simply be two vowels in hiatus because onsetless syllables are prohibited in Blackfoot. And indeed, when we consider, the same constraint ranking that we had before, candidates like C and D, where there is a syllable boundary that begins at the left edge of the prosodic word, are ruled out. And the reason is that you incur further violations of onset. Okay. All right. So we've shown now that there is a left edge of a prosodic constituent. We've shown that there is a vowel that spans that boundary. And then finally, we want to consider candidates which allow mismatches in syntax and prosody in order to align the left edge of the prosodic word to the left edge of a syllable. This is going to require a redefinition of match constraints, and I will talk about this from the framework of match theory, because that will give us a rigorous way to talk about the syntax and prosody correspondence here. And we need to redefine match constraints so that they are violated by over or under parsing underlying material, but that they are not violated by epenthesis or deletion. Match theory, as laid out in Selkirk 2011 and in earlier work as well, uses match constraints to require exact correspondence between particular syntactic and prosodic constituents. And since it's couched in a parallel evaluation of constraints in optimality theory, that means that match constraints can also be violated by higher constraints, can also be violated in order to satisfy higher ranked constraints. So the syntax-prosody correspondences that were originally laid out in match theory suggest that particular kinds of syntactic elements, like the syntactic clause, the syntactic phrase, or the syntactic word, match to a very small set of prosodic constituents. Okay. So here I have basically taken verbatim the match phrase definition in Emily Elfner's dissertation and generalized it a bit so that it is not simply for phrases, since we're concerned about the prosodic word. Let S be an input representation and P the output phonological representation. Then suppose there is a syntactic constituent that exhaustively dominates a set of one or more terminal nodes. You will assign a violation mark if there is not a phonological constituent in the phonological representation, which exhaustively dominates all and only the phonological exponents of those terminal nodes. It's a very useful definition because it's rigorously defined. And in this case, all of the match constraints will ignore phonologically null syntactic structure as well as traces. So for us, the match constraint that we are concerned with is the one that matches little vp to the prosodic word, and that's what we'll be using on the next slide. Now, in this case, if we consider this match constraint, our optimal candidate actually violates the match constraint itself. And the reason is that there is an element here in the phonological word which was not an exponent of any of the morphemes here because it was epenthesized. And so in order for our optimal candidate to still come out the winner, we need to rank this match constraint below the positional markedness constraint. So far, so good. There becomes a problem the second that we consider alternative candidates, which instead satisfy the alignment constraint between prosodic edges and syllable edges by allowing violations of match. So in this case, candidate B will be optimal. Why? Because we didn't bother epenthesizing anything. We didn't bother violating uniformity. All that we did was shift the prosodic boundary to the left. And so now we've avoided violations of this positional markedness constraint against non-continuous continuant segments. We have instead violated the match constraint, and since match is ranked below the positional markedness constraint, and since we have not violated any of these lovely constraints down lower, candidate B is always going to be optimal. And that's a problem for us because we've got evidence from the way that the word is pronounced that candidate B cannot be correct. We really need some kind of candidate that has a long vowel with a mid-vowel quality. We might think to ourselves, okay, perhaps we could consider other candidates that are just like C, but that also allow this misalignment between syntax and prosody. And so I'll show that to you next. So A, B, and C are exactly the same, and candidates D and E still have the correct vowel quality. So this would be compatible with how the word is spoken. And instead, there's a covert change, one where the prosodic word has been misaligned to the left, and the other where the prosodic word boundary has been misaligned to the right. The problem with these is that they either violate the match constraint itself or the higher ranked positional markedness constraint, in addition to many of the same constraints that we saw before. And all of these are harmonically bound. So the candidates C and D are harmonically bound by candidate B, and candidate E down here is harmonically bound by candidate A. So there is no re-ranking that we can resort to in order to get C, D, or E to be the optimal candidate here. Okay. So this is pointing out two problems with the match constraints. One is that we do need to penalize over-parsing, as in the case of B, but we don't want to penalize epenthesis, as in the cases of C or D. Okay, and there's a second point which has already been pointed out by Peter Gwezian, which is that match really needs to distinguish between over-parsing and under-parsing so that we can get the difference between those two languages at the beginning of the talk. So what I've done in as a redefinition of match is to simply make sure that we set these things in correspondence, right? So as long as we only assign violations when there is some segment in the underlying form and it has a correspondent in the output phonological form, then we'll get the right results. We don't want to assign any kind of match violations if there's been epenthesis or deletion, because in those cases, there is some segment either in the underlying form or the output form that doesn't have a correspondent in the opposite form, okay? So this kind of redefinition harkens back strongly to definitions that existed earlier in the literature. It's very similar to some definitions in earlier work by Downing as well as Peter Gwezian. The difference here is that I've simply changed the bolded part so that we don't penalize epenthesis, basically. Okay. And once we've done that, then everything works out okay. So something like depth between the syntax and prosody, we don't want to include any element that wasn't in the little VP into the prosodic word, which we've done here. So the ah in the prefix was not part of the VP because it's not included inside of the curly brace, but it is included inside of the prosodic word because it is in the square bracket. That occurs a violation, but something like epenthesis will not incur a violation of this sort of match constraint. Why? Because the element that was epenthesized here did not exist somewhere outside of the little VP in the syntax because it doesn't exist at all in the input, okay? So we've redefined the match constraints to not penalize epenthesis, to only penalize over and under parsing, and in this case, we get the right results, okay? I will just skip to the summary at this point. So all that is here is showing that this sort of redefinition also works for the other positions within the phonological phrase after a consonant and also at the left edge. And just to summarize, I've claimed that in Blackfoot, prosodic edges and syllable edges misalign quite systematically. And instead, Blackfoot is a language that maintains the syntax and prosody alignment. And this, I think, is an expected typological gap. So if we consider a subset of the constraints that I've shown you, they all include a positional markedness constraint. In the case of Blackfoot, it was a constraint against non-continuant segments. And in the case of IsiXhosa and Kihehe, it was a constraint requiring that the prosodic word begin with an onset. There are two syntax and to prosody correspondence constraints. This was the redefined match constraints. And then there is one alignment constraint that requires alignment between prosodic word edges and syllable edges. And given a factorial typology of these, then Blackfoot is exactly a predicted language. So it's a language that violates the alignment between prosodic word and syllables and maintains alignment to the best of its ability between syntax and prosodic elements. Okay. Thank you so much. I'm really happy to take any questions at all. Super.
Thank you. Thank you, Natalie. Very interesting pattern like we find in Blackfoot. So this is not directly related to the whole thesis of what you're saying, but like just a very minor point in the segmental. Like when you have this K followed by the ip, there's this S inserted. Does it have any role, or like, or maybe you mentioned it and I glanced it over, but.
So in this case, I think that it's a bit orthogonal, but I can talk about it. Let me see, actually, how do I get out of here? So, oops, oh, okay, that's what happens there. Yeah, there is, at least in the case of epenthesis, this assimilation, so changing the plosive K to an ICULINC is regular. But it's not the case that every underlying vowel E will cause assimilation. So there do exist in underlying form sequences of ka plus E or xa plus E. So ka and xa still seem to be, you know, somewhat contrastive. But in the case of epenthesis, then that contrast is neutralized. You always get xa before an epenthetic E.
I see. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, Emily Elfner from Yale University.
Hi, Natalie. Thank you so much for the talk. I just had a question. I think it might also be somewhat tangential, but so at the beginning you talked about evidence for sort of there being a prosodic word boundary between the prefixes and the roots, I guess. I was just wondering whether you'd considered ideas like that it could be a recursive prosodic word rather than a sort of non-recursive word, or whether you'd considered that as a possibility. I don't know if that would help your analysis or change your analysis or not, but
yeah,
just wondering if you thought about that.
Good question. And part of the issue is that, sorry, I seem to have opened up like the short version of this handout. Okay. Part of the issue is that this is just a small piece of the puzzle, but you can see that at the left edge of the whole phonological phrase, there are different constraints that hold than at the left edge of the prosodic word when it's not bumped up against the phonological phrase. And that's not an accident. So if we're looking also at right edge effects, there's a difference in what you see at the left edge of the verbal complex versus at the left edge of the stem. If we're looking at domain span rules, there's also a difference. And so, yeah, unfortunately, these can't be reduced to a recursive prosodic domain at all. Where there does seem to be recursivity, which is something that I'm looking into now, is as you stack on extra prefixes to the front, each of those seems to induce a new prosodic word. So it seems like you get this inner prosodic domain recursively at the left edge of every prefix. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Can I have with this the mismatch cases that you saw that you analyzed? I was just wondering whether there were any phonetic correlates that you were able to find. It's not necessary, as we saw in Emily's talk, it's not always the case that we will have any direct correlates, but
so are you asking like at that left edge boundary?
Yeah, at that left edge. Yeah. Did you see anything like when you look at it? No,
absolutely not. So like the most robust evidence for Blackfoot phonological phrases, let me see. Okay, cool. So the most, oops. Yeah, there we go. Let's get back to this picture. So the most robust phonological evidence for a domain in Blackfoot is actually for this entire verbal complex. And this entire verbal complex, which I've argued is a phonological phrase, syllabifies together. So what we might expect then, is if we put several words together in a phonological phrase, do they syllabify together, which is something that I've begun looking at, and it seems like, yes, that's the case. So entire phonological phrases are just like, they have good syllable structure all the way throughout. And then the question of like, is there any sort of boundary information here? It's less robust, and it's exactly what I just talked about. So it's these root alternations. And the fact that they interrupt what is otherwise phonologically regular. So recall that down in these suffixes, we saw, syllable structure driven epenthesis in the way that we might expect to see. And that regular process of epenthesis kind of looks like it gets interrupted here. And it's only when you look at the broader pattern of how all of these root alternations work together that you see that there must be some kind of edge there. But it is really interesting that all the evidence for this inner edge is more morphophonological, right? So it's like it got shoved down lower. I mean, interestingly, if you compare Blackfoot to other Algonquian languages, each prefix prosodifies as a separate prosodic word. So there's clearly been some change in prosodic structure in Blackfoot.
So it opens up more area for investigation when you really want to have a full picture of the prosodic syntax interface, basically. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So what would be nice is if the differences between Blackfoot and other Algonquian languages fall out from a theory, perhaps like match theory, in the sense that we might expect strong start to, in some languages, cause the prefix to prosodify as its own prosodic word, and maybe in Blackfoot that's ranked lower in such a way that instead we get these recursive prosodic words building all the way up inside of this verbal complex. But the other place to look that we just don't have a lot of information about yet is really looking at the phrasal side of things in Blackfoot as well. So multi-word phrases and longer clauses.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I think we will first wrap up the official part of the talk, and then the discussion will continue afterwards. Let's give an applause to Natalie one more time. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank two assistants, Yukki Baldoria Wu and Miyu Iizuka, as well as the Liaison Institute assistant, Michinori Suzuki, for, in helping me out with organizing this event. This event was supported by the shared budget of ICU Research Institutes and the Institute for Education Research and Service and the Linguistic Lab at ICU. We have another part, the last part of the Prosody series, scheduled on December 19th, 2 weeks from now. Fatima Hamlaoui from University of Toronto and Lauren Clements from University at Albany will share their research, and the talks will be held from 10 a.m. Japan Standard Time. More information, including titles and abstracts, can be found on the ICU Linguistics website. Thank you all who participated in today's colloquium. We hope to see you on December 19th. The recording will now be stopped.